close out talking about writing your own custom functions in JavaScript with a couple other topics. One is talking about how to declare your variables with let versus var versus const. And then another one is talking about arrow functions. So first off, let me go ahead and clear out a lot of the content that's right here and kind of start over from scratch again. So if you're going to be using a variable that you plan to overwrite from time to time, let's for example say string employee name, you could declare it like that. But if you plan for it to never change, you can use another declaration keyword, which is const. And so pi would be a good example of that, 3.114.159. And if you were to try to overwrite pi, let's go ahead and watch what happens in a browser in just a second. I'll say pi equals, and then I'll try to change it to something else. I'll hit save. All right, I come over here and it says uncaught error, assignment to constant variable. So you can't do that. So notice it's on line 13. So you can't reassign something that's fixed. So this might be good, again, if you needed something to stay the same, maybe the tax percentage you're planning on using in your program, or maybe it's a reference to a database or something like that, the database connection string, etc. You don't want programmers overwriting that if you're working in a team of programmers, and so you could set it up as a constant. Another thing you can do is you can use the keyword var. All right, I didn't quite exactly write out all of employee name there. But let and var can be used interchangeably. Now, in most code that you've ever seen written in JavaScript, you'll see it prefixed with var. And there's going to be billions of examples on the internet of people using var in their source code to work with variables. Now, for the last several years, really the only thing that you want to use anymore is let. They work almost identically, but you can do some things if you declare something with a var that are really weird. So here's kind of what I mean. If I were to say alert and I were to reference this variable right here, I'm going to get an error in my code. But if I do alert and I reference this one that's declared later with a var, I'm not going to get an error message because it does something called hoisting. Even though it hasn't been officially declared yet or set to anything, I could even declare it right there and assign it. If I were to put this in here, it's going to be empty and not set to this yet, but it won't generate an error because this variable has somehow come into the scope of the document. Now this is really weird functionality, to be able to use a variable that technically hasn't been pulled into the computer's memory yet. It's just a weird accidental thing that they created in JavaScript that doesn't work in any other language. It could result in unpredictable outcomes in your program, and so basically every expert on the planet says just don't use this ever again because that's weird. You're better off doing code that uses the let statement, and then your code will throw an error if the variable hasn't been explicitly set up. Also, just as a side note, you can just randomly in code just declare a variable like this. You can say like my var equals something, and when you do that, it automatically makes it a global variable of type var. Again, that's a very bad practice. Just declare things with let 100% of the time, unless you want it to be a constant, and then you're going to be good and safe in all things. Okay, so that's enough about talking about the different types of variables that you can declare. Let's get on to our last topic, which related to custom functions, which is arrow functions. Historically, in just about every language, you can always type something that looks like the word function, like which we just have been doing. Let's go ahead and do an example of that type of function syntax right now. So if I write the word function, and let's just say I want to double the value of a number that gets passed to it, I'll say function double it. I'm going to pass in some num, and I'm going to return some, make sure I've got the right spelling here, the variable I just made up, return some num times 2, and then down here I'm going to call the function and use it. I'll say console.log, so I'm going to print out to the browser's debugging console that does JavaScript. I'm going to say double it, and I'll pass in some number like 15. So I'd be hoping to get 30 back out. So let's go ahead and hit save. I come over here, and it's showing up in the console. Now, just as a reminder of how you would get to that, let me resize this a little bit here. I can right-click on here, do inspect, go to console, and there it is. So I keep on refreshing the page, and I get the same answer. So this is a historical, typical way of writing functions that has always worked and should always work in the future. However, it's become in vogue in recent years to do alternative syntaxes for writing functions. So let's go ahead and show you an alternative way of doing this exact same thing. So I'm going to comment this out and do command /, and let's write this differently. I'll say let double it equal some num, arrow, curly brace, return some num times 2. Save. All right, and I'll just change this to a 10 so that we can see that this is working as expected. So I hit save. I bring in this window over here and see it brought up a 20. I go ahead and hit reload a couple times and it's happy. Okay, so functionally speaking, what I've done in this function and that function is identical. So this new type of syntax is popular. It's called a Lambda function, or it's called an arrow function because it's got this little area right here. So if I break this down, we don't have the word function anymore, and instead we are taking this function name and using it as if it's a variable. So we're basically taking a function right here and assigning it to a variable. And then where we usually pass things in the parameter area right there, you'll see it sometimes like this and sometimes like this. So this thing right here ends up being the one or more parameters that are being passed into the stuff that's in the curly braces. And then rather than having nothing after the curly braces, we do this little arrow right there. All right, so let me show you a different way of viewing this. I'm going to ask the question, how did this happen? How did we get from here to here? Well, let's do this in steps, because there's a couple different variations we can use that are between these two extremes. So I can say let double it equal function some num, and say return some num times 2. Looks like I forgot my parenthesis there. Okay. Oops. Okay, so I went from this function that looks like this to setting this variable equal to a function that looks like this. And from there, I could go to the next step, which is I could get rid of this and then put that right there, and then I finally get to that syntax. So if I go back a little bit, I've got 3 different ways of declaring the double it function, with like this, or like this. We could do this yet another way. I've been showing you passing a parameter, but we don't have to pass a parameter. So I could say let hello world equal and I could say console.log hello world, and then I could call hello world right here, and it would run this. All right, so if you're an astute person, you might be saying, I don't really see how this type of syntax is significantly less typing or better than this type of syntax right here. And you're basically correct. However, there's a style of programming that's used in JavaScript. It's going to make heavy use of arrow functions. One of the things that you're going to find a whole bunch, especially as you get into something we call asynchronous programming, which allows us to write a lot of JavaScript code that executes in parallel rather than sequentially. And because it can be executed in parallel, not sequentially, we're able to do amazingly fast things with JavaScript, and that's why we like JavaScript so much. One of the things that happens when we're writing asynchronous code is there's going to be a lot of functions in JavaScript where we pass in to some function another function that we want to be called as soon as the function is done doing whatever it's supposed to do. So in practice, what happens is there'll be a whole bunch of commands, in similar syntax to this, one after another, but just because we get past the line doesn't mean it's actually done doing what it's going to do. Potentially a couple seconds later, after we've said go do this thing, it's going to finish what it's doing on the inside, and then as its very last step, it's going to call the name of a function like double it or something else that you have passed in, and we call that a callback function. At any rate, a funny way we like to describe this is it's what the cool kids do. So the old fuddy-duddies, we use regular function syntax, and then the cool kids these days, they use this arrow function way of doing things. The good news is that either of these ways of writing things is still absolutely correct, but you're going to see this new arrow way of doing things all the time. Just know that whenever you see this, you might have to stop and think for a second and go, oh, that's arrow syntax or a Lambda function way of writing things. And so you might just have to think for a second about what's the parameter that's being passed into the function and then being used there. All right, I hope that you've enjoyed learning a lot about functions. On to the next topic.